Welcome. I'm so thrilled that you're all here. This session is being recorded so we can share it later. Welcome to this session titled Accessibility in Language Teaching for the 2024 CU Boulder Disability Symposium. I am the host for today's session, and my name is Erin Cunningham Ritter. I'm a 47-year-old white female with a long dark ponytail and wearing a white blouse. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Alla Savelieva for today's session. But before we get to that, the University of Colorado Boulder is hosting the Disability Symposium to acknowledge that more work must be done to improve inclusion of persons with disabilities on the Boulder campus. Efforts to improve inclusion must focus on students, staff, and faculty. The 2021 CU Boulder Campus Climate Survey Report, which was released in April of 2022, found that 44% of undergraduate students and 47% of graduate students reported experiencing incivility in the prior 12 months. For students with disabilities, these numbers climbed to 54% and 62% respectively. This symposium is a springboard to continue campus-wide conversations on how each of us can improve inclusion on campus and improve support for all persons with disabilities. Also, to kick things off, the symposium organizers, including myself and David Braz here, would like to take a moment to issue the CU Boulder Land Acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous people, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. We will do this by educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. We will do this by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is both inclusive and respectful. Now it's my great honor to pass things over to our presenter, Alla, for today's presentation. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you everybody for being here, for taking the time. I know it's a busy time in the semester, so I really appreciate you being here. Okay, so my presentation today is about accessibility in language teaching. And I'd like to focus in this presentation specifically on auditory processing disorders such as dyslexia. And I do acknowledge that I cannot cover all of accessibility in this presentation. So the context of my presentation is me as a language educator here at CU sharing how to make language teaching more accessible to students in an in-person class. So my students come to class physically. This is an in-person class. And I acknowledge that this is just one tiny sliver of, the discussion of accessibility in higher ed and language teaching. My talk today stems from the desire to learn more about accessibility in language education, as well as solicit feedback from the attendees and my colleagues, and perhaps find a professional community as well. I have not had training opportunities, but I teach students with auditory processing disorders every day, and I want them to thrive in a language classroom. To start off, I'd like to know a little bit about the attendees today, like what brings you to my talk? What do you do and why are you here? So maybe you could shoot a short message to the chat or just unmute your mic. In the meantime, I also want to share the Arts and Sciences pre-survey. So please take a minute to take the survey. So would anybody like to share what brings them to my presentation today?
I'm happy to share. So my name is Ruth Moore, and I'm the director of the International English Center here on
Hello, Ruth.
campus. Hi. And we work with many students and many who probably have some of these disorders. So we're always looking at new ways of approaching instruction. So thank you for having this workshop.
Thank you for coming to my presentation. Okay, David says he's here to learn more about CU faculty and working on inclusion in the classroom. So that's very cool. Thank you, David, for being here. All right, so Laurel. Okay, Laurel is an academic advisor. Yeah, so students take 5-6 semesters of language, and Laurel's here to learn more about supporting such students who are in a language classroom. Sarah has been helping me out with this presentation. So Sarah works for CTL and Asset. Thanks so much for being here. Gabriella, we shared the same classroom. So Gabriella finishes her Spanish class and then I come in with my Russian class. And yeah, I was learning more about the modified language program in our Spanish department, and Gabriela works there. So it's really cool. Not only is that we share the same classroom, right, but we also share some interest in language learning and accessibility. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again for being here. Please take a short survey, pre-presentation survey for the symposium organizers. In the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about the outline of my presentation. So, like I said, I am exploring how to support language students with APD, and I'm gonna define dyslexia as it is one of the most common conditions. I'll also talk about the impact of APD on language learning and also discuss how the support strategies for learners with APD. This presentation is made accessible. I also looked into how to make presentations more accessible. And if you would like to see my slides on your own device or for later reference, you can also download them through this QR code. And I'll also share this QR code once again at the end of my presentation. So, dyslexia. It is one of the most common conditions that people are diagnosed with. And I want to preface this with the fact that we language educators at CU do not learn from the disability services that our students have a particular condition, but it's our students who volunteer this information to us. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by the difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. This definition is provided by University of Michigan. And I think what is important to highlight about dyslexia is that it is connected to the way our brains work, right? So this phonological component of language processing is part of our brain. And I like this definition because it points out that it's unexpected to other cognitive abilities, right? So such learners might be as well really good at math and succeeding in other subjects, but conditions such as dyslexia make it especially challenging for them to be in a fast-paced language course, such as in college. And according to different agencies, about anywhere between 5 to 17% of the entire population have a form of dyslexia or APD. For example, National Center on Improving Literacy states that dyslexia is the most commonly diagnosed learning disability, with about 15 to 17% of the population. So now that we define dyslexia, how does this affect language learning? So like I said, the key challenge for learners with APD is it's not easy for them to be in a fast-paced language classroom despite their preparation efforts, right? And this happens for two reasons. It's a phonological orthographic processing and syntactic processing skills. And it's really important to highlight that the origin of dyslexia and other APD is not anxiety or lack of preparation from our students, right? So it's the way the auditory phonological orthographic module in the brain, the way it works, that's affecting language learning and not anxiety. Rather, anxiety is a consequence of such learners' frustrating experience in a mainstream language classroom. They get anxious because they try very hard and it doesn't work in a mainstream classroom, but anxiety is not the origin of dyslexia. Now, I'd like to talk about specifically my experience as a Russian language teacher. At CU, I teach beginner Russian. So Russian is quite challenging to learn because students need to learn a new alphabet. Moreover, that alphabet comes in two forms. That's print alphabet and cursive alphabet, because the way Russian speakers write is cursive, so it looks slightly different, at times quite different from the print alphabet that you will see in textbook or on the internet. Additionally, similar letters and sounds carry grammatical differences. And other peculiarities of the language are that parts of speech need to agree. So, for example, grammatical gender of nouns and adjectives and modifiers need to be the same. And then you also need to conjugate all the verbs. So this is an example. This slide has the Russian alphabet. So in the main bigger boxes, you can see the cursive alphabet, and in a smaller box in the top right corner, you see the print. So you can get the idea that this can be quite challenging for all language learners, but especially for learners with APD, the fact that you need to learn not only a completely different alphabet, but it also has two versions. Next, I have examples of how similar letters and sounds carry grammatical differences in the Russian language. For example, here there are two forms of a possessive pronoun moi versus mai, right? So masculine singular moi the way it looks, it's just such a slight difference with the top sign in moi versus mai, which means my but plural. Then I also have an example where stress in a word is the only difference that carries a lot of meaning. For example, nominative plural noun houses, dama, stress on the second syllable, versus at home, doma, which is prepositional case of the same noun in singular form. So this can be challenging for a mainstream learner, but it gets especially challenging for language learners with APD. So that brings me to the question, how to support language learners and how to support all language learners, not only learners with dyslexia. I think the two important principles here for me are allowing learners to demonstrate what they can do, and also explicitly teaching my students how to learn a language. And here I'd like to talk about the difference between accessibility and accommodation. So when processes or experiences are not designed to be accessible, people with disabilities may have to receive accommodations to be able to participate or engage in the learning process. Accommodations are reactive changes or alternatives to an inaccessible process that are made to provide an individual with access. For example, if a mainstream test or exam is too taxing on students' working memory, they may need to request an extra test time through the Disability Services Office at CU, right? In another context, for example, for a learner with visual impairment, right? If there is an online form that is not usable for them, then they may need to complete the process over the phone instead. And accessibility here means proactively making your content accessible so that you reduce or eliminate accessibility barriers when you are first creating or designing a process or interaction in the classroom. So now that we know the difference between accessibility and accommodation, it's time to talk about Universal Design for Learning, UDL. I attended a couple of sessions with CTL and ACID dedicated to UDL at CU as part of my CTL certification training. So that information comes from CU website on CTL website on UDL. I'm sure a lot of my attendees here know about UDL and heard of it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. I just want to say that UDL is an educational framework aimed at providing all students with equal opportunities to learn, regardless of their individual learning needs, abilities, or backgrounds. It is grounded in the concept that diversity in learning styles is natural. It encourages designing learning environments, materials, and strategies that are flexible and adaptable to a wide range of learners. So specifically, to language classrooms, UDL stands on the principles of proactive design to all learners, multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, and multiple means of engagement. Now, how do I try to incorporate these principles into my language classroom? First of all, I'd like to talk about consistency. I think consistency, routine, and structure are key to successful language learning. for all students, for students with of all abilities. Excuse me. Learners with processing disorders find it less taxing on their working memory to rely on consistency, meaning consistent deadlines, straightforward organization of the course, formatting, directions, setting clear deadlines. So all of this really helps them. And it also helps other students, right? So if we're thinking of UDLs, and I'm trying to create a language learning environment that would work for everybody. So my routines include folders, which I think is a great way to help students learn about organizational techniques and learning techniques. So get a folder for your Russian class, consistent directions, clear and concise directions, regular review, and plus technology is also here to help. So when it comes to my course structure, right, I downloaded an accessible CU syllabus that is much easier to use if you use a screen reader. I provide Canvas course outline. Canvas is our education management platform that complements our face-to-face teaching and learning. My students can see all the deadlines ahead of time for the entire semester. And the way I organize my Canvas is also by weeks. So for every week of the semester, students can go there and see exactly what our learning goals are. They're phrased as can-do statements according to the ACTFL guidelines. And they can see the course outline so they know exactly what's coming every week. And I think that is a great support for students to enjoy the classroom and to kind of feel at ease because they know exactly what's going to happen in the classroom, and that helps lower their anxiety. CU Digital Accessibility Office provides an accessible syllabus and also guidelines for PowerPoints, how to make them more accessible. Then let me speak here a little bit about the use of English when necessary in a classroom. So I just referred to the ACTFL guidelines about phrasing learning objectives as can-do statements. But when it comes to target language used, ACTFL also recommends a 90 to 10% breakdown between the target language and students' native language. And I still do my best to adhere to that, but I feel like to make my classroom more accessible and to support students with strategies such as metacognitive learning strategies, sometimes I have to switch to English, right? And lately, language pedagogy tends to highlight more that a language classroom is a multilingual space, right? That going back and forth is natural for people. And what's important here is finding the right balance, right? We're still trying to get students to use the target language as much as possible, but there are moments where it is important to use English as well, especially when it comes to supporting students of all abilities, right? So that brings me to metacognitive strategies. So metacognition, thinking about thinking, teaching students how to learn is about teaching them those metacognitive strategies. It's important to explicitly teach all learners, including learners with APD, how to learn a language. Especially for me that I teach beginner Russian, I don't know, maybe a lot of my students tried a different language in high school. Some of them never had a chance, so they're starting just now that they are in college, and they may not be aware of how to actually strategize their language learning, and this is where metacognitive strategies are really important. When educators use metacognitive strategies, they raise awareness for strategies among their learners that engage them in direct, explicit thinking processes about thinking to arrive at knowledge that is available when tasks need to be completed. In other words, metacognitive strategies are problem solvers, right? It is part of teaching students how to learn a language. So make language learning a discovery learning process in which students turn into language detectives. So in this framework, students should be encouraged to find out about the structures and uniqueness of the new language, why certain expressions are used the way they are, and how they can self-correct and monitor their own reading and writing. So to me, metacognitive strategies also include conversations with students about the linguistic worldview. So in my case, that's Russian language, right? And sometimes I need to stop and explain to my students, well, this is how Russians imagine the world, and this is reflected in the language. And it's also an opportunity for me sometimes to draw on my personal experience, and I share with my students what was challenging for me to understand in the English linguistic worldview when I was starting as an English language learner. I still am, after all these years, operating in a second language right now, right? So I'm still learning about something new about English and about English speaking worldview every day. And I think it's important for students to know that I went through the same process, and it's actually kind of ongoing process. Next, another metacognitive strategy is teaching students about test taking and an exam persona. A test is not really an adequate reflection of the real world language used, right? But unfortunately, tests and exams are an integral part of learning a language in an academic environment. And I think it's important that language educators talk about test-taking strategies to their students. An exam persona is also very important. So I encourage my students to be cheeky devils, play with the language, and see how they can strategize to pass their exam, especially oral exams. They can be very stressful because you need to produce a dialogue or a monologue on the spot. And even though there is preparation for it in class and outside of class, this is still quite stressful. So I always tell my students that, hey, what you say in the exam doesn't need to be factually correct. This has nothing to do with the honor code, but if, for example, an exam prompt asks you to talk about your pets and describe your pets, if you forgot the word for dog, then talk about cat. I'm not going to care about whether it's factually correct or not, and if you actually have a cat, right? What's important is that you are creative and you can pass the exam and complete all the communicative tasks. So for a lot of language teachers, because I think a lot of us, a lot of my colleagues, we were initially learners for whom language learning was a little bit easy, right? So a lot of times they can be an assumption that, oh, my students probably know about the strategies, but I think if we teach all learners, especially learners with auditory processing disorders, how to be successful in language learning, then it's really important to explicitly talk about these strategies to them. Next, so going on with metacognitive strategies, here I'd like to talk about metalinguistic strategies, which ask students to really analyze the language structures, and they are real lifesavers because they allow students to use their strengths, right? Focusing on what they can do rather than what they cannot do. Because For learners with APD, we're talking about trying to compensate for weaknesses of visual and or auditory processing, right? So it's important to talk to students how they can figure out what an unknown word is, even if they don't know that word, right? So which elements surrounding the word can help them understand. Looking at the word without knowing what that is, if you look at the ending or at the stem of the word, can you understand what part of speech that is? Is it a noun? Is it likely to be an adjective? Right? What parts of speech need to agree with this part of speech? What is the word's stem? You see it in the text, read it, whisper it to yourself, right? Does it sound like any other word that you already know? Is it a cognate, meaning a word that looks and sounds the same and means the same thing in the target language and in your native language? Is it a compound word? If it's a compound word, what are the stems? Can you guess the meaning of that word? Right? So these are all the strategies that need to be explicitly taught to all language learners, but they are especially meaningful for learners with APD. Next, I'd like to talk about multisensory learning. Here it is, again, part of the universal design for learning. It makes it makes a language classroom fun to all learners, right? It also aids us to be more aware of the attention span of our language learners, right? So it's not easy to focus your attention on something for longer than 10-15 minutes, but it is especially challenging for learners with APD. So this is where multisensory learning can really help. And here are some of the examples of laminated big cards, sign cards that I use in a classroom. So the top card says, I have a question, and it's provided with a little icon that can facilitate recall for my students. The middle one says, are you ready? Right. So for example, if I'm saying, okay, let me pull up the listening exercise, right? And then read the task, and then I'll show the card. Are you ready? And it is accompanied by a corresponding icon as well to prompt recall. The third one asks, do you agree? So I'm going to talk about this card in the next slide, because this has to do with getting consensus on the right answer among all of the students. Another strategy I use in my class are letter and sound cubes. So this particular technique was letter and syllable cubes was designed by Zaitsev, who researched how to help elementary school children learn reading in Russian. And this is what my supervisor, Professor Galina Nicole, suggested that I use in my classroom. I really like it. Students love it. Each cube also has bottle caps inside it, so they rattle, they're colorful, and it's really fun to show students in class how to work with endings for nouns and for adjectives. So this is a lot of fun, and it helps me maintain student attention. Oops. This handout has to do with total physical response, but also trying to engage students' tactile senses. This is an additional handout that I provide to my students to work with something fun. This is grammar, but it's given in the form of, take this handout. If you have time at home, then cut out those options that I'm showing on the left. So guess which option corresponds with each box, then also fill in the blanks in the handout, glue it to the handout and then hand it in, right? So there's a little bit of work, and just the fact that they're doing something with their hands, I think really helps. Another way you can use total physical response is also, for example, for Russian verbs of movement, like to arrive and to leave, you can discuss a total physical response together with the students in the classroom, right? So you can let the students decide which physical movement they're gonna assign to which verb, right? And then we practice the steps to make sure that we all remember what that means. So it's also a fun way to engage students in the decision making in class. That brings me also to the value of peer learning in class. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about my cards to prompt the use of Russian as classroom communication, and also to provide some visuals for the students. I do encourage consensus building in the classroom so that it's not me as the ultimate knowledge holder in class. I'm just a guide, right? There's so much information students can learn online in additional textbooks and literature and mobile apps. So I'm just there to guide them in the learning process, right? And I never give away the correct answer. I never immediately confirm or correct a student's answer. Rather, my students need to all build a consensus of whether the answer is correct or not, right? So that's a way of peer learning, but it's also a way to make sure that all students are paying attention, even if they're not the one answering right now, but they need to be aware is that I need the consensus, so they all need to pay attention and listen, and they need to agree, or maybe say, no, I think differently. I think this is the correct answer. So I have this green card, which asks, do you agree? And it's easy, even in the beginner class, to answer because it's either yes or no. So it doesn't involve a lot of target language use, but it's still there. And then the second card, the card on the right, says help, right? So if I show that card, that means that, I'm inviting other students to help explain either the correct answer if they agree with their classmate, or maybe if they think something else, then they also have an opportunity to elaborate. And also, what's really important is encouraging students to study from each other outside of class. So I really encourage my students to form study groups. I think they have a group chat where they prepare for tests, quizzes, and exams together. And plus, Alltech, another CU unit, they provide tutoring, right? So a peer tutor, somebody who's maybe 2 or 3 semesters ahead of my students, is also a great way for them to learn more. And peer learning is great because they can relate to each other, and peer tutors know exactly what my beginner students are going through. So I think that's also a nice way for them to meet people who are also interested in language learning and get help. Shout out to Alltech for setting up a really cool tutoring opportunities. By the way, today they have World Languages Showcase. So if you have time right after my presentation, then head to Alltech and learn more about language learning opportunities provided at CU. When we talk about universal design for learning in a language classroom, it's also important to talk about flexibility and differentiation, right? It doesn't mean that all learners need to do the exact same thing to get a grade. I think we should introduce a lot more flexibility here, especially when we work with students with APD. So this has to do with strategies such as flexible task completion. So I can divide warm-up or other activities into 3 levels, such as progress, proficiency, mastery. Peggy Veal, who actually teaches French language in Colorado. So she talks about this in her article in FLT magazine in 2016, that if you have a warm-up activity, you can offer students to, you can ask them to complete task 1, which is the least challenging. And then if students want to go further, right, you can also add task 2 and 3, and that would mean that they are getting very proficient in the topic, and 3 means that they're really mastering the topic. But at the same time, it's also completely okay if you want to do just number 1 for today. So this has to do with the idea of offering language opportunities in a buffet style where each student can pick whatever they feel comfortable with today. Here I have a visual that's an example of how my students told me they prefer to learn about seasons and weather in my Russian language classroom. So when I was providing the new vocabulary for seasons, winter, spring, summer, autumn, my students said, hey, why don't you just draw a little icon next to them, right? A snowflake, a flower, sun, and a leaf, so that we can recall those better. And I thought, well, this is brilliant. I don't know why I haven't thought of that. And so for the next day when we were doing a review, I actually showed them this slide and said, hey, I made this because you helped me, right? So it's also important to ask students how they prefer to learn. Next, I'm going to talk about my ongoing discovery of how to reduce cognitive load for all learners, but that's especially important for learners with APD. So I'm looking at ways of streamlining exam sections and task instructions. Sometimes it's really difficult for me to understand whether my task instructions are going to be clear or not. So I really appreciate my colleagues' advice, because somebody else looking at my quiz or exam handout can really give me a suggestion. Hey, maybe, try to rephrase this. And shout out to Sarah Andrews from CTL and ACID. She's been helping me with this. So yeah, I think the best for all language learners in a classroom is that task instructions, my directions to students are concise and very clear. And for me, this is still an ongoing process. I also provide my students with regular writing or tracing routines to continue practice Russian writing. Like I earlier said, it has to do with practicing Russian cursive. So here you can see the example of cursive writing drill that I hand out. And I found a cool website to generate my own. And I use the vocabulary for that unit for a tracing routine, so that we can, as we write, we don't just write the words that maybe my students don't need for this unit, but those are exactly the words that they need. This is a vocabulary from the unit. And when it comes to differentiation and flexibility, I can give out 2 options, right? With tracing, which makes it easier because you just trace, or without tracing, and that's a little bit challenging, and students can decide which one they want to complete. Another very important element of effective language learning is positive reinforcement. As language educators and all educators, we want to foster a growth mindset amongst our students, and also provide a supportive and encouraging learning environment. This, again, is especially important to support students with APD, such as dyslexia or dysgraphia. A growth mindset is really not about somebody's innate ability or talent, right? It's more about how resilient you are, because learning a language at a fast-paced college course is not easy. So, as the more positive reinforcement you provide, the better, right? So even when we provide feedback, we should be using positive, constructive language. This is great thinking. Who or what can help you get to the right answer, right? What do you need to do next to get closer to the correct answer? So all of this really helps to establish a supportive and encouraging learning environment. This is related to the notion of affective filter, which can be briefly defined as emotional barriers to learning. This closely ties in with a discomfort and fear of saying something and making a mistake. And some learners have a very low affective filter, so they just chat away, they're not as focused and they're not afraid of making mistakes. And some people have very high affective filters, right? And it's important that we do everything to lower the affective filter for all language learners, and acknowledge that it's okay to make mistakes. This is how you learn. In fact, this is how we learn our native language, right? When children start speaking, they make a lot of mistakes, but that's completely fine. So the older we get, right? So by the time we're in high school and college and further into adulthood, we forget about that. So I think it's important to remind students that that's okay to make mistakes, right? We can all learn from this, and a mistake can be like a place of really a positive reinforcement and an opportunity to learn a little bit more about why it is used, this particular structure is used this way, and why people say it this way. And all of the strategies I described previously, they all help to lower the affective filter. Plus, humor helps. That also helps to build safe learning environment. Allowing students to have rethinking time is also good. So not necessarily cold calling. That could be the case in the language classroom, but if they need some rethinking time, that's fine. You can get back to them later, and that allows any learner to collect their thoughts and participate. So just to highlight the key takeaways for me in the process of learning more about accessibility in teaching a language is that I think it's important to meet students where they are, right? And this ties in closely with UDL and making sure that our classroom is accessible to all learners. It's also important to think of how we can improve learning for the students that we have now, right? Because I think it's important to start small and with tiny incremental changes, or something that we can test in the classroom on a small scale. That's already a huge step in making your classroom more accessible to all learners, rather than thinking, oh, I don't have time. This is already the middle of the semester, right? I will hopefully do something really big in the future. And I think it's important to really focus, like, what can you do now for the students that you have now in the classroom, right? How can I help the students I have now? What small thing can I adopt and use next week rather than next semester? And lastly, making learning accessible to students with APD and other learning disabilities and all learners in the classroom is really an ongoing process, right? I think it's also important to acknowledge that we cannot implement everything at the same time, but if we start with small steps, that's already a huge progress. And before I finish and ask for, if you have any comments or questions, I also want to acknowledge the people who supported me in this journey. So Professor Ann Butter from Spanish and Portuguese Languages and Literatures, my supervisor, Professor Galina Nicole from the Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures, Shout out Sarah, Andrew, and Karen Crouch from CTL and Asset. They've been helping me a lot in my language teaching journey at CU. Digital Accessibility Office, Allison and Megan helped me. And also thank you so much to the organizers of the symposium, David and Aaron, huge thank you to you. Yeah, so now I really would like to hear from my attendees. So like what strategies helped you? Are you a parent? Are you a language educator? Are you interested in future collaboration? Can we meet for coffee to discuss what's up with language learning? Like, let me know.
Okay, Alla, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can I ask, well, I mean, since we have a couple of minutes for discussion, it looks in your presentation that you put APD and dyslexic exactly in that same category without distinguishing them much. Although a lot of research said that these are two different disorders. So my question is, and I think we discussed it a little bit earlier, but maybe you can elaborate. So dyslexic students and students with APD, if it's both are present in your students, you realize that it will take them significantly more time, more effort to achieve results that students without this disability would achieve. And you are teaching them in the same group. So how frank you need to be with them to let them know that they are probably not going to succeed at the same level as other students will do. Or sometimes they would need to repeat the course to reach that same level. So how do you handle this problem?
Yeah, this is these are really good questions. My understanding of APD and dyslexia is that dyslexia is a type of auditory processing disorder. So this is how I approached it, but I'd like to hear more on the difference.
No, the difference is with dyslexia, they know about this even before they start, learning a foreign language because they have issues with the native tongue, with the English, right? So they have trouble reading and writing. With APD, it's an additional challenge, a phonological challenge that affects their listening, which means that all four, forms of communication, listening, speaking, reading, and writing are affected. Whereas with dyslexia, it's only reading and writing. So if it's a combined APD and dyslexia, it makes it particularly challenging for students to achieve results. And so I heard from colleagues, especially with larger classes, that they would be quite frank upfront saying, well, you would spend a lot of efforts, but the outcomes are not going to be great. So
I see. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I haven't really had any of such frank, straightforward discussions with my students. I think this is definitely something to explore. And I think they probably also themselves know by now that if they are in a, oftentimes students who join beginner classes only in college, I think they already may have had frustrating experiences with trying to learn a language previously in school and high school or outside of academic setting. Yeah, but being frank and straightforward with students with APD and dyslexia, I think this is definitely something to explore.
mm-hmm. Thank you.
Alla, I just have to say what I loved about your presentation, I forget what you called it, but you have to have a cheeky, devilish attitude for your test taking persona. And I just
Absolutely.
love that. I'm going to steal that with your permission. I think that's so cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's something that is not obvious. That's why I bundle this with metacognitive and meta-linguistic strategies, because it's just something as a language educator I figured out over many years of teaching, but also myself taking plenty of English language exams and Spanish language exams. And this is actually, I figured out quite arrived at as like, this is a strategy I should teach to my students, right? Quite recently. But I thought, this works for me, right? I've heard from my Spanish teacher as well that, listen, when I go into this classroom, don't be shocked. I'm going to be a completely different person. And I'm not necessarily going to tell, the truth about my family or my likes or dislikes, right? I'm working with what I can pull and produce right now. So you, as my fellow classmate, you see this, please don't be very surprised, right? Like, I'm going to be a different person in the exam. And this also taps in with larger ideas that when we learn a new language, it's almost like we're discovering a new or like another personality in ourselves. It's a different sound system. So even when we speak a foreign language, our face moves differently, right? Because the phonetics of another language is different. And it's something to share with our students, that this is part of your language learning journey. You can be something in a language classroom. And when you operate in a foreign language, you can be something you're not in your native language. And use that as this awesome opportunity to explore the world, explore yourself, who you are, and have fun, on the way. I also have the resources. They are available as part of the presentation. Yeah, so I'd like to.
Well, and I'm doing a time check. It looks like
Yeah.
we need to start wrapping up. A couple of data points for you all. We'll be posting this presentation on the website, the Disability Symposium website, once we gather all those resources. Also, if you could take a moment and do our post survey, it really helps us kind of gauge outcomes. And I'm trying to put it in the chat. There we go. Gauge outcomes for each of our sessions, and it helps to help secure funding for the next round. So if you could take a moment, that would be great. It looks like we're about at time. So I don't know about you. I learned so much. I want Alla to be my teacher. But let's give her a big thank you for sharing her expertise and for the great service that you do for our students. We're really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you really to the organizers of the symposium. Thank you to all my colleagues and everybody who supported me along the way and came to participate in my presentation. Thanks so much.
Well,
and
we're right at time. You've got some good love coming your way in the chat. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Alla, and thank you to all of our participants. We hope we see you at some subsequent sessions. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.